Well. Today we are joined by Amanda Coletti. She's a graduate student in the Department of Communication at the University of Connecticut. The reason why she's here today is that she just published a brand new paper. We're talking about a couple days old. But of course, Amanda, you've been working on this, I'm sure, for quite some time. The paper is titled Examining Oral Communication Skills in Communication Training Programs for STEM Professionals, a Systematic Quantitative Literature Review. Now, Amanda, before you tell us about the paper, tell us a little bit about you and the work that you're doing, because you are heavily invested in looking at science communication more broadly. Tell us the kinds of questions you're asking and what has led you to this paper.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Connecticut, and I study science communication, storytelling, and training program evaluation. Basically what I do is I design, deliver, and evaluate storytelling training programs for STEM professionals to help them become better storytellers and tell better stories about their research and their experiences in STEM.
Wonderful. So in this paper, you looked at oral communication training programs, right? And you found, I believe, 16 studies. So tell us about that. What led up to you doing this work in the first place?
Yeah, so it was in my second or third year in the grad program, and I was searching for and reading articles about how people are developing training programs and evaluating these types of science communication training programs. And I would read some great reviews and book chapters that talk about the project. But when I would write my own literature reviews for projects or other papers, I started to see some trends that were happening and comparing these programs together and looking at how their outcomes were different across different studies. But I hadn't come across a paper that was like that. So when it came time to complete my qualifying exams in our program, we were assigned to conduct a systematic quantitative literature review, or QLR for short. So when it came time to do my qualifying exam, I thought this was the perfect topic that I wanted to do, because this was the paper that I wanted to read. So I was interested in looking at studies that conducted a science communication training program and evaluated it, and looking at comparisons across different programs.
Yeah. So what were the key insights, if you will, early on from your work?
Yeah. So I originally started to see, it seemed like most often there was kind of positive evaluations of science communication training programs, that they seemed to have a positive effect. But there was a large variety in the types of programs that were being offered, in the skills that they were suggesting that they could improve, the methods that they used in order to try to improve participants' skills. So in conducting this kind of quantitative literature review, it's basically a method that systematically analyzes the existing literature on a topic. So it's very similar to a meta-analysis that kind of quantifies characteristics in the literature, so we can make broader kind of generalizations about across studies about a topic. So it's kind of referred to as mapping a subdiscipline.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of looking at studies across different types of studies.
Yeah.
So
And now,
sorry.
for some folks that are probably listening to it now, I'm just curious, for this paper, who was your target audience? Who did you want people to read this paper in the first place?
Yeah, so I think originally my target audience was someone like myself, a student or a researcher who's interested in learning about kind of the broader trends in science communication research and how training programs are developed and how impacts are measured. But I feel like also another key target audience is the practitioners themselves. So trainers, facilitators, teachers, people who want to design and evaluate these programs on their own. They can learn how previous programs have been developed and evaluated in the field, see how they compare to each other, and maybe learn some best practices for implementing in their own programs.
Yeah. And one of the key things that we keep hearing about from the landscape is actually lack of evaluation, or the difficulty in doing such evaluation, right, in programs. And so you were able to find these 16 papers that have looked at these programs, right? I'm curious, who were publishing these works? Were these external research evaluators, or were the actual program designers and developers themselves that were publishing insights from their programs?
Right. So it was a lot of faculty researchers, people who are interested in science communication. They developed their own programs. They evaluated it. Some people were, STEM teachers, STEM professors who wanted to develop these programs and publish some of their results from it.
Mhm.
A lot of like industry professionals, like some of those like findings are in unpublished papers, so they weren't included in this particular study. But overall, yeah, those were the types of researchers who were conducting the
I see.
studies.
And you mentioned that you found a diverse set of things, right? But is this something that really struck out for you? Like you saw this sort of phenomena, if you will, anything like that from that analysis?
Yeah, I think the main kind of takeaway from this paper was that there is an overall positive impact of these
Hmm.
types of programs on
Hmm.
STEM professionals' oral communication skills.
Hmm.
So some of the things that I was kind of observing more casually when looking at the literature, that was one thing that ended up we found in this research.
Hmm.
So it really demonstrates, the value that these types of programs can have for improving people's communication skills when talking with different types of public audiences.
Yeah.
But I think that another kind of really interesting finding is that there are, some gaps in how different people are measuring outcomes of oral communication skills. So I think that one of the kind of implications could be this need for collaboration between facilitators and STEM professionals with science communication researchers, with training and development researchers that have kind of the social science background to match those program goals with the methods that they're using to evaluate or with developing training programs. So, for example, if someone is interested in determining whether or not participants improved over the course of the program in their oral communication skills, conducting assessment both before and after the program instead of just after the program is essential for demonstrating that change. So having those kinds of conversations where you're matching your evaluation methods with the goals that you have in developing those programs in the first place.
Yeah. And is that easy to do for developers?
I mean, there's a lot involved in it. When you read papers like this, it comes off as very easy, but there's a lot of work that's involved in, you know, trying to determine what exactly your goal is and making sure that that's clear and relevant to your audience. Conducting needs assessment of your participants and making sure that what you're designing is, actually what they need and actually what they'd enjoy is a lot more tricky than you would think, because people tend to just teach what they know or teach what they want or what they think that audiences want, but really kind of determining what exactly those goals are and matching them up with different methods, because it's not exactly a one-to-one ratio. It really depends on a variety of different methods that can fit goals. So it's not entirely easy, but it's definitely, doable with some work.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the collaboration aspect of it, right? Where if you can, maybe even from the earliest stages when you're trying to create something like this, a program or a course or whatever it is, right? Working with folk from diverse areas. I'm curious from your analysis. You said positive, right? This training is having positive effect. Can you tell us, like, I want to push you a little bit there. What do you mean when you say positive? In a sense, is it that the delta between the pre and post has gone up, 5 percentage points or something? Or what else are you referring to?
Right. So I specifically use that word positive because there was a variety of ways that
Mhm.
people did measure their communication outcomes. So some studies did do that pre-post where the communication skills improved. Some studies just looked at post evaluation only. So it was like a more positive evaluation of what they experienced.
Yeah.
So I use that word sort of specifically in the case that it's not always consistent in between the studies, because this is a new field. People, are just starting to learn really how to evaluate these kinds of studies and these kinds of programs. So it was a variety of different types of measurements. So some
Yeah.
of them were pre-post, that delta change score. Others were post evaluations that were more positive in general, that showed reflections of people enjoying the program and thinking that their own skills had improved.
Yeah. And I think ultimately for these programs, they have to attribute it back to their own goals, right? What were they actually trying to do, and measuring that change? I assume the challenge for you, given the diversity of the approaches here, I mean, the task was probably not easy for you, right? To try and compare and contrast, well, because it could be apples and oranges at
Right.
times, right? And so maybe that could be one of the things for a reader. Like, what would you tell a potential reader of your paper? Like, why should they read this?
Yeah. I think that this paper, gives a great sort of synthesis of a lot of the research that's happening in this field at the time. like you said, I was able to find, a certain number of studies, looking at other types of quantitative reviews and other types of meta-analyses. The number is, smaller than bigger meta-analyses tend to, look at. But I think that this is a great sort of preliminary synthesis of what people are doing in the field and how they're designing programs and how they're evaluating these impacts, which I thought was missing in the field when I was looking for these types of papers. So I think that people could get, some great, synthesis of what's going on, as well as learning a bit of, if they want to design a training program, what factors should they consider? What methods could they consider when thinking about their own goals? So from both a research interest perspective as well as a practical perspective, I hope that people can get lots of benefit from it.
Yeah, and then also when we talk about impact, right, there's short-term impact, right, and long-term impact. I'm assuming these programs came in different lengths of period of time when did their analysis. Was it mostly in the short term, kind of immediately after, or did you see some that did it like 1 or 2 or 3 years later to see if their change, the change stuck?
Right. It was mostly short term. I think, the resources required to do longer term evaluations are definitely a lot more. And especially in getting people to respond to surveys, years down the line, it's a lot harder to do. But that's something to keep in mind, is that, sometimes those longer evaluation periods are interesting and necessary, but they're not really there yet. But one thing I did notice in terms of the duration was that most of these studies are moving away from the kind of one-off types of communication training programs in favor of the multi-session or multi-week types of training programs that really foster that kind of reinforced learning, and that skill development takes more than just a one-off type of workshop.
Which is interesting because there are a lot of workshops, right, that are out there around science communication, and they're in that like couple hours, one week or so, and then you get another cluster around like main courses. So the university courses, the 3-month period, right, and then the fellowship kind of come in and at the 12-month period, right. So everybody is coming at this from multiple angles, and the duration is interesting, right, because that also impacts the training itself, right, and what you're able to learn. Can you comment on that some more?
Yeah. And I think that there's definitely value, in those as one-off training programs. I think especially for some STEM professionals who have never really thought about science communication before, or don't really know a lot about the field. Those can be great opportunities for people to like learn about the field, maybe take home like 1 or 2 tips that they can kind of use and implement. But when it comes to more in-depth skill development, that's where some of these multi-session or longer training programs can really help, where people can practice what they're learning, people can get feedback, they can, figure out what went right or what went wrong and implement changes in improving going forward. So it's good to see that in these studies that they were moving towards evaluating those multi-session types of programs.
Yeah, and it's actually important that you're saying these studies, because I think the landscape of actual training programs out there, initiatives, so we call initiatives, if you will, right? You found 16, and there's so many more, right, that are not being evaluated, or at least the data is not being shared publicly, right? So what's the hope for the future here in this area? What do you want to see more of, like in terms of the research questions and work?
Yeah. So I'd love to, like I said, see more, collaboration between STEM professionals and communication researchers to help match their evaluation measures to their goals. But, some of this, need for maybe using multiple different types of methodological approaches. So incorporating both quantitative and qualitative research, incorporating validated measures into your evaluation practices so that you can make broader generalizations statistically to the broader field of knowledge. But going back to the quantitative and qualitative, a lot of times some studies will measure just quantitative. Some STEM professionals will think, yeah, I've done poster presentations before, I'm comfortable with my communication. They'll rate their communication skills as a 5 out of 5 or a 4 out of 5. And then they go through the program and they learn a little bit more about communication. And then they, realize how much they've grown. And they're like, yeah, 4 out of 5, 5 out of 5. Or they'll rate it as like a 3 out of 5 because they realize how much more they still have to learn about communication. So from a statistics standpoint, right, it looks like there's no change or maybe a decrease, which doesn't look great. But having that qualitative data on the side can help one explain, you know, those quantitative findings that may or may not make sense or may not ring true for participants, but also qualitative data can help get more of that perspective. How are they feeling about the program? How are they feeling about their own skills? That's helpful to reveal certain things to trainers that they might not have known before about their audience.
Yeah. And so just going back to my question as well, just to dig a little bit deeper, in terms of the questions that researchers like yourselves are now curious about asking at this juncture, right? I think there's more work coming out looking at training, right, very explicitly, right? We had that study by Anthony Dudo, for example, that looked at the fellowship programs, right, and talking to the program directors, and, you know, funding and all these other things came up, recruitment and diversity, right, being challenges. But what are the sort of the newest questions now that are sort of burning for researchers like yourself who are looking at this landscape?
Yeah, I think one of the it's kind of a classic question, but I think it still applies, is that we want to know whether, you know, the training is effective, like whether it works. I think that is still the broadest and most important question, because one, we want to be able to help our audience, we want to be able to help our participants in improving those skills. We also want to make sure that, you know, if these programs do work, that we can demonstrate that through data, through evaluation, so that we can show others and potentially get funding for more programs like this and be able to host more programs like this. But also look at, you know, variations in, you know, how we present material, the types of material we present, the types of strategies that we use to help STEM professionals learn communication skills, and the different types of approaches, and how different approaches can be more or less effective in teaching these types of skills. So I think that there's definitely still a lot to learn and to uncover about how we're running and evaluating training programs, but this is a sort of initial kind of look at what's happening in the field as of now.
Wonderful. We can talk all day long, and we need to have you back because I know you're on fire, publishing papers left and right. So the paper is out now, examining oral communication skills in communication training programs for STEM professionals, the systematic quantitative literature review. Amanda, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been great.